Chapter 4. Allan woke up early in the morning, stiff with cold and with a pounding headache. He was also dying for a drink of water. Fortunately, a heavy coat of hoarfrost had formed on the inside walls of the cabin, and by chipping this off, he was able to get enough moisture to satisfy his thirst. After this first mouthful, Allan took the carving knife and scraped frost off the walls until the pewter mug was half full. Then he went over to the barrel and filled the mug to the brim with rum. He took the rum and water, sat on the chair, and stared around at the cabin. He was still exhausted from his work of the day before. His arms felt as heavy as lead, and it was a struggle just to lift his legs. But he had to plan things out, get everything in the cabin picked up and put away. He had to make some sort of cover for his opening to the outside, and he had to see about breaking through to the rest of the ship. But for now it was so good to sit there and feel the rum start working its way through his body, warming his insides and his legs and arms. When he felt warm all over, he went outside to answer the call of nature. The sky was overcast and it was quite cold, around the freezing mark, he guessed. He climbed up on top the rounded back of the Ann Forbes and looked in all directions. The first thing he noticed was that the ship was no longer on the edge of the open water. The Ann Forbes was now frozen in on the seaward side by a solid 50 yards of piled-up ice floes. This pleased Allan because it lessened the danger of the Ann Forbes breaking loose and going to the bottom. Allan shaded his eyes and looked over the open sea water. There wasn't a hint of a sail anywhere, but then he didn't really expect to see one. He should rig up a pole and flag of some sort to use as a signal, but what was the use? There were no ships anywhere in his area. Feeling depressed again, he climbed down from the keel and went back inside the Ann Forbes. He poured himself another half mug of rum and took a couple of long swallows. He might as well get drunk. What difference did it make? He was a dead man anyway. If he didn't die from starvation or thirst, then the cold would finish him off. And if he managed to survive the cold somehow, then loneliness would drive him mad. He finished the rest of the rum, staggered over to the closet, and climbed in. Shutting the door behind him, he sank down on the bedclothes and pretended he was back home in his own bed. He didn't want to think of the world outside his closet door, didn't want to face the fact that the days were getting shorter and that in a few more weeks there would be no daylight left at all, nothing but constant darkness for 3 months or more, and the sea would be a solid sheet of ice for hundreds of miles in all directions. Allan shook his head. He was done for. There was no mistake about that. Even if he found enough food and water on the Ann Forbes to carry on a hike over the frozen ice to the nearest land, he didn't know in which direction to travel. And even if he made it to land, which would be a miracle, he was still likely to starve to death. He did not know how to hunt or find food the way the Eskimos could, which meant that he would have to find some Eskimos and hope that they would feed him. The trouble was that Eskimos were few and far between in the polar regions. It would take another miracle to find them. "I'm a dead man," Allan said aloud in the darkness. "A living dead man." It would take too many miracles to save him, and he had already been granted one miracle, being the only one still alive from the shipwreck. To expect 3 or 4 miracles in a row was madness. And if he stayed on the Ann Forbes, if he managed to find enough food to survive through the winter, chances were that the ship would sink when the ice broke up in the spring. And should he manage to stay on the iceberg after spring came, the berg would drift south and eventually melt. So either way he was doomed, and no one would ever find out what had happened to Allan Gordon and the Ann Forbes. Mercifully the rum went to work, and Allan soon fell asleep. Hours later he woke up shivering. He fumbled his way out of the closet, scraped some ice off the wall of the cabin, and then sat down, ate a dozen biscuits, and drank a mug full of rum. He stared blankly at the cabin window, where the daylight was already starting to fade. He should do something. There was something he had to do, but he could not remember what it was. But that rum felt good. He was on the Ann Forbes, only there was no one else with him. What happened? Where was everybody? Why was it getting dark so soon? He stood up and then watched in amazement as his body fell to the cabin floor. "Here now, that won't do at all, Allan Gordon," he scolded himself. "You are a regular drunken sot and a disgrace to the whole Gordon clan. Come now, like a good lad, get to your feet and climb back into bed." Somehow he made it back to the closet and tumbled inside. It took him a good 5 minutes to get the door closed and his body arranged beneath the bedclothes. He began to think of home then, and his memories carried him swiftly back. It was Saturday morning and he was a 12-year-old lad again, with a pair of bright tin pails, picking blackberries out of the hedges lining the road that ran past his house. He filled both pails, walked down the lane, and turned in the gate to his cottage. He was walking toward the front door, about to call out to his mother, when he heard a voice he hated above all others, the voice of Bunty Duff, the schoolmaster. He tiptoed past the door, set the blackberries on top of the wooden churn in the storeroom, then went around by the back of the house and squeezed himself beneath the rear window of the kitchen. He sat with his back against the whitewashed stones of the wall and listened to the conversation that was going on inside. "Another 2 years would be wasted on him," Bunty said. "He's a good size now and ready for work. He's picked up a bit of reading, but he's hopeless at writing. It's all he can do to write his name. Put him to work. He hasn't the brains for school." "Aye, right enough. The lad shows no taste for the books," his mother agreed. "Still, I thought it would be nice if he stayed through the 6th grade. Then he might be taken on to learn a trade or work in a nice shop." "Ach, not that lad," the master said scornfully. "Put him to work right away, woman. He's a lazy lump and he hasn't brains enough to fill a thimble." Allan stole away into the orchard and hugged himself with glee. Hallelujah, he was all through with school. Never again would Bunty give him 6 cuts of the bamboo cane across the fingertips. Never again would the master bang his head against the blackboard or keep him late after school. He was free at last. All summer he had begged his mother to let him go to work in September instead of back to school. And now his prayers were answered. Now he would wear long pants and a cloth cap and learn to whistle at girls. But happy as he was, a little poison entered his soul. He had not known that he was stupid. If the master said he was stupid, then it must be so, because who could tell better than the master? But what harm if he were stupid? Who wanted to go around with his head stuck in a book all the time? And if he wasn't the brightest lad in the world, he could make up for it in other ways. He was cheerful and a hard worker, and those things were important too. Allan groaned and sat up. Night or day? He pushed open the door of the closet. It was pitch black and piercing cold. He hurried to the rum barrel, patting his way with his hands, and poured himself another mug of the burning liquid. A fast trip outside, then he got back into the closet and waited for the rum to stupefy his brain again and let him forget the ice and cold and loneliness. And again the rum worked, and he drifted off into a strange, hazy world of dreams and old memories and vague plans for the future, a dream world that ignored the silent, icy waters outside the captain's cabin. And so Allan lost track of time. All he did was sleep and drink rum, although once in a while he would stir himself enough to eat a few biscuits or chips and ice from the cabin walls. Whenever he woke up, he would drink a cup or two of rum, wait until he was nice and warm and feeling drowsy, then climb back into the closet, burrow underneath a jumble of piled clothing, and go back to sleep. When the cold woke him several hours later, he would drink another cup of rum and repeat the routine. It was a vicious circle. He would wake up shivering and would have to drink a sizable amount of rum to bring warmth to his body. However, the rum would soon make him sleepy, and he would head back to the comfort of the closet. It was the 3rd or 4th day since he had broken into the ship, and Allan lay in the closet, thinking of Mr. Craigie, his first boss on leaving school. Allan had been apprenticed to William Craigie, a tailor in Aberdeen, and spent 12 hours every day in keeping the shop clean, in running errands, in sorting wool and worsteds, in making the long, simple stitches in first-run sewing, in picking loose threads off completed coats and jackets, in scrubbing the master tailor's lapboard every morning, in waxing threads, in effect doing the 101 things that made Mr. Craigie's life a little easier. Was that Mr. Craigie shouting? Allan slid back and forth between his dream world and the real world outside his closet. Where was he? What was going on? Someone wanted him, was calling for him. Was it the yellow man coming out of the orchard? But there was no one there. He was all alone on the Ann Forbes. Or was he back in Craigie's shop? Or were those voices in his dream? Or had someone broken into his cabin and was right now eating his biscuits? That's what it sounded like. Hungover, half asleep, sick and confused, Allan worked the closet door open and peered out. He was just in time to see the heels and legs of a woman flash through the window. He distinctly saw the bare soles and pink toes of her rather large feet. He tumbled out of the closet, not knowing what to expect. Picking up the boat hook in one hand and a harpoon in the other, he went to the entrance he had tunneled out. There, above him, on the ice, were several large polar bears. They had been drawn to the ship by the smell of blubber coming from the holds, and were now trying to dig their way into the Ann Forbes. Allan was horrified at the size of the holes they were making in the ice with their powerful paws. But something else shocked him even more. 2 of the bears had managed to drag forth several bodies, and Allan thought that one of them was the corpse of his late captain. The bodies must have been those of sailors who had been thrown into the water when the Ann Forbes went down. Shortly after the collision, they must have floated to the top of the water and then become frozen into the new ice that was constantly forming. With fear and disgust, Allan watched the bears tear at the corpses. He had to get rid of them, chase them away from the ship. He went back inside the cabin for the captain's speaking trumpet. Carrying the trumpet outside, he stopped at the end of the tunnel and shouted with all his might, "Avast, ye lubbers!" 2 bears stood up on their hind feet and stared with curiosity at Allan. The animals appeared to be 8 feet tall. After a minute or so, they dropped to all fours again and resumed their feeding. The polar bears were not a bit frightened of Allan. They are the largest land animals to be found in Arctic regions, and most of them never see a human being. With the exception of the male walrus, whose tusks they fear, polar bears will attack and kill any animal they run across. Again Allan shouted at the bears, still hoping to scare them away. Finally, one of the huge beasts took an interest in Allan. Lazily, the big white bear swung around and began to pad his way toward the tunnel. Allan, his head finally clearing of sleep and confusion, suddenly realized the danger he was in. He tucked back into the cabin and looked wildly around for something to block the window. He found an iron grate that was used to barricade the window against thieves when the Ann Forbes was in port. He dropped the grate into its slots. But would that be enough? All that one of those powerful bears had to do was push hard with one paw, and the whole grate would break away from the window frame. For a moment, Allan stood still. Then he heard the snuffling of the bear at the end of the tunnel. Allan grabbed up the lance and stuck it out between the bars of the grate. He would jab with the lance when the bear reached the window. He waited several minutes, but the bear, though still at the end of the tunnel, did not come any closer. Allan continued to wait, his heart thumping wildly in his chest. Still the bear did not come any nearer. Allan withdrew the lance and leaned it against the wall near the window. He had a new idea. He would tie knives and forks to the grating, with their points facing outwards, so that the bear could not get close enough to the window frame. He had earlier noted a large ball of string on the floor and picked it up, along with 6 knives and forks from the captain's personal silverware. Working as quickly as he could, he tied the utensils to the bars of the grate, cursing his stiff and awkward fingers as he worked. He was so nervous and excited, so afraid that the bear would suddenly charge the window, that he kept dropping things. And for some reason he could not get the knives and forks to stay well tied. He would wrap a knife in plenty of cord, and then minutes later the point would be drooping as the string mysteriously lost its holding power. He forced himself to be calm and work slowly. What made everything twice as hard was the knowledge that the bear was still at the end of the tunnel. Every once in a while, Allan's work would be interrupted by the sound of a grunt or a cough from the animal. Each time it happened, Allan's heart stood still and he stopped what he was doing and grabbed up a lance. Finally, though, he had a dozen sharp-pointed knives and forks tied to the bars of the grate. Feeling a little safer, he withdrew from the window and sat down in a chair, the lance resting across his knees. Allan soon found, to his surprise, that he was sweating. The excitement and the fear had driven all the cold from his body. It was strange how all of a sudden he wanted to live. He wanted to survive and go back to Scotland to see his family again. For a while there, for 3 or 4 days, he had not cared whether he lived or died. But out on the ice, when he realized the bear was coming for him, he had also realized that he had given up. And he had given up without a struggle. Just then, when it looked as though he might be killed, he felt a terrible wave of self-pity surge through him. Because young Allan Gordon had been given, through a miracle, the gift of continued life. And Allan Gordon, like a great big baby afraid of being left alone in the dark, had curled up and pulled a blanket over his head. He was acting just as he used to act when he was afraid of the Yellow Man, the strange unknown monster that lived at the back of the orchard when he was just a baby. For years he had feared the Yellow Man, knew that someday the Yellow Man would leave his secret cave in the orchard and come into the house and gobble him up. He was 9 or 10 before he got over his fear of the Yellow Man, and finally realized that such a monster did not exist. And the strange thing was that Allan could no longer remember who had first told him about the Yellow Man. For years Allan had been afraid of something that no one else knew anything about, something that he must have made up himself when he was just a child. Because when Allan finally described the Yellow Man to his mother, she had never heard of such a creature before in her whole life. Instead of hands and feet, the Yellow Man had huge yellow claws like a lobster. His nose was a long yellow trunk like an elephant's, and from the bottoms of his ears 2 yellow tails hung down. Those tails could whip around your back and hold you tight while the claws tore chunks out of your flesh. There was only one good thing about the Yellow Man. Because of those hard yellow claws on the ends of his legs, he could not run very fast. But if he ever cornered you, it was awful what would happen. Allan went over to the window frame, looked out, and listened. There was no sight or sound of the bear nearby, although he could hear claws scraping further out on the ice. He left the lance leaning against the window and went back to his chair. Old Bunny was right. He didn't have a thimbleful of brains, or he would never have gone out on the ice and stirred up the brutes. He hadn't been thinking straight. Allan went over to the bread locker. Sometime in the past day or night he had left one of the tins of biscuits on the floor with the lid off, instead of putting it back inside the locker. The bear had pulled most of the biscuits out of the tin and scattered them over the floor. That was probably when he woke up, Allan decided. He began to pick up as many of the biscuits as he could find. At least the other 2 tins were safe inside the bread locker. Allan now realized that his despair and fear had led him into a very dangerous practice. From now on, he promised himself, he would only drink rum when it was absolutely necessary to get warm or to stay alive. He had been what the master said he was, a lazy lump with no brains. He had plenty of work to keep him busy. He had to get some order into the cabin. He had to get into the other holds and find a stove and coal and more food than just those biscuits. Even though he might never get off the iceberg alive, the least he could do was to see how long he could last before the end came. He put the tin of biscuits away in the food locker and pulled the Bible out of his pocket. The first thing he had to do was to keep that promise to his mother. He sat down and read 5 pages to make up for the days he had skipped. From now on, he wouldn't miss a day. After that, he felt better and began to go through everything in the cabin to see exactly what he had on hand and what use he could make of everything. And although the bears went away that evening, they were soon to pay Allan a return visit. Only the next time, he would not be quite so lucky.